Have you ever felt like your whole life you were invisible? Even in your own family, treated like nothing? That was me. Until my father's death changed everything. His will wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a time bomb that destroyed my brother and gave me a power I never imagined. Want to hear how I got my revenge on the people who humiliated me for years? My brother thought he had buried me under years of humiliation. But little did he know, our father had planned the perfect revenge from the grave. That's how it all began. My name is Claire, the youngest daughter in our family. And for as long as I can remember, I was treated as if I were invisible. My father loved me quietly, I think, but he was always consumed by his empire, our family business, a company that printed money faster than we could count it. My older brother, Daniel, was the golden child, the heir, the one everyone respected. Me. I was the decoration, the afterthought, the artsy kid who was supposed to stay out of serious matters. When my mother passed away, I was only 16. After that, Daniel's control over the household tightened. He had always been smug, but now he had our father's ear in every business decision. The board members whispered about him like he was already the king. I wasn't even allowed near the boardroom. Every time I showed interest, Daniel would laugh. "This isn't your world, Claire. Go paint something." His words stung, but I swallowed them. For years, I swallowed them. Our father grew older, and illness started to weaken him. By then, I had resigned myself to being nobody in the family hierarchy. Daniel strutted around as if the crown already belonged to him. He brought in his cronies, old friends from college, greedy men who saw our company as their personal casino. And together, they made me the family's running joke. Every family dinner was the same. Daniel mocking me, the others chuckling, my father silent. But silence does not always mean weakness. When my father passed, the funeral was cold. No tears from Daniel, no grief on the faces of his allies. They weren't mourning a man, they were anticipating a feast. The reading of the will was scheduled a week later. I thought I'd be ignored once again, maybe given some art supplies or a summer house while Daniel inherited the empire. But I underestimated my father. He had left behind more than a will. He had left behind a plan. We all sat in the lawyer's office. Polished mahogany table, walls lined with old books, and that suffocating air of fake civility. Daniel leaned back in his chair, smirking as if he already knew the outcome. His friends sat nearby, whispering like vultures waiting for scraps. I sat quietly at the end of the table, prepared for humiliation. The lawyer, a stern man with thin glasses, began to read. The usual formalities: debts, small properties, donations to charities. Daniel was getting impatient. I saw his fingers tapping against the table, his smile tightening as he waited for the empire to be announced. And then the twist came. "My business, my company, my life's work," the lawyer read, "shall not be inherited by any one of my children freely. It shall be given to the one who completes the conditions I have set forth in this will." The room froze. Daniel leaned forward, his smirk faltering. Conditions? Our father had written conditions into his will? The lawyer continued. To inherit, each child must participate in the opening of a sealed box containing letters and instructions. These letters must be read aloud, in the presence of all beneficiaries. Only after the conditions are fulfilled will the company's true successor be revealed. Daniel's jaw tightened. His allies shifted uncomfortably. And me. For the first time in years, I felt my heartbeat quicken with something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Because I knew my father. He wasn't a sentimental man. If he had chosen to write letters, they weren't going to be meaningless. No, they were going to cut deep. The first envelope was placed on the table. My father's handwriting on the front. To my children, open together. Daniel snatched it before I could even touch it. He tore it open, unfolding the letter with an annoyed huff. He began to read aloud, his voice dripping with impatience. "Daniel, Claire, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I built this empire from nothing, but I also built a family. Or at least I tried. Daniel, you were always hungry for power. Claire, you were always searching for meaning. Both of you disappointed me in your own ways. But one of you disappointed me in a way that cannot be forgiven." The air thickened. Daniel cleared his throat, pretending the words didn't sting. His friends exchanged awkward glances. The letter went on. "I know what was done. I know who betrayed me, and who betrayed this family. The truth is in the letters that follow. Read them. Complete the tasks. And only then will the rightful heir be revealed." Daniel crumpled the letter in his hand. "This is ridiculous. The company belongs to me. Everyone knows it." But the lawyer shook his head. "The conditions must be completed. Your father was explicit. If you refuse, the company will be sold, and the profits donated to charity." Daniel's face turned pale. He wanted the empire. He wanted the throne. And he wasn't about to let some silly letters take it from him. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about inheritance. This was about revenge. My father, from beyond the grave, had created a trap meant to expose Daniel for everything he had done. And I was about to watch it unfold. So, I stayed silent. I watched Daniel squirm. I let him take the bait. Because deep down, I already knew my father's revenge had only just begun. And I was going to help him deliver it. Tell me, if you were in my place, would you play along with the game? Or would you burn it all down just to watch them suffer? My father always said revenge is an art, and he left me the brush. After the will reading, the house felt like a stage set for something inevitable. Daniel sulked. His cronies whispered about loopholes and legal maneuvers. They believed money and lawyers could unmake any trap. They were arrogant, and arrogance is a thin skin overwrought. I had watched them for years. The small gestures, the way Daniel's laugh stopped when a useful number had to be paid, the way his hand lingered a fraction longer over contracts that shrank other people's names. Those details became the scaffolding of my plan. I didn't know the law. I didn't need to. My weapon was patience, the will's rules, and the letters my father had sealed away. The lawyer handed each of us a second envelope. "This contains your first task," he said, and his gaze flicked to me with something like pity, the kind of pity that smells like victory. Daniel ripped his open with practiced indignation. "A ridiculous scavenger hunt," he scoffed aloud, reading the demand. "Stage a public apology at the company's headquarters, confessing a fabricated mistake that cost the firm a trivial sum. Humiliation, the kind a boardroom could savor." His cronies laughed. They believed humiliation was the currency of the weak. They were wrong. You need to understand what humiliation did to me. For years, I had been reduced to a punchline. I had the capacity to be broken by it, and yet somehow the memory of my father's quiet encouragement, the small notes he left under my sketches, the patience in his voice when I wanted to learn, hardened me instead. When the lawyer finished, I felt a cold sort of clarity. This would be theater, yes, but theater with stakes. My father didn't want petty apologies. He wanted truth to scrape the varnish off their reputations. He wanted them to squirm in front of their peers, to feel that public discomfort that corrodes a man's arrogance from the inside. The first task was a trap that seemed small but was calculated to show character. Daniel's cronies were delighted. They imagined a short, humiliating speech from one of the lesser children, nothing more. They didn't expect the audience to turn the humiliation into a mirror. I volunteered to do the apology. The room went quiet. Daniel barked a laugh like a challenge. You want to embarrass yourself on my stage." His voice was loud and hungry, the kind that feeds on spectacle. I smiled and accepted. If Daniel thought he could write me off by humiliating me publicly, then he had given me permission to use the stage he loved. My apology had to be believable. It needed the sting of truth without the danger of legal repercussion. I wrote it late into the night, tracing the cadence of our family's language, the way scandal was framed in polite company. I confessed to a minor misallocation of petty funds, something so trivial it would raise eyebrows but not lawsuits. I apologized for naivety. I begged forgiveness with theatrical contrition. When Daniel's cronies heard the draft, they applauded the simplicity. "This will be over in an afternoon," one said. They loved the idea of a quick spectacle, a ritual that allowed them to feel better about themselves. They didn't see the second layer. On the day of the apology, the boardroom was filled with our most polished faces. Cameras were discreetly positioned. Daniel insisted the event be recorded for corporate transparency. He wanted his image preserved as the generous, reasonable heir. I stepped onto the stage with hands that felt steady. I spoke the lines we had rehearsed in private, the words shaped to appear sincere. The audience nodded. Some even smiled with mercenary relief. But then I did something small and deliberate. I named names. Not in an overtly accusatory way, but in the manner of a person who cannot help but link causes to effects. I mentioned a vendor, an abandoned contract, a missing shipment, details only someone paying attention would notice. The board shifted. Daniel's face tightened. I continued, weaving tiny truths into my apology like poisoned thread through a tapestry. The cameras caught every expression. The cronies thought they had the script. They didn't realize my apology was a map. Those public details were breadcrumbs I had left intentionally, breadcrumbs that would lead any curious journalist, any auditor with patience, to the fractures in Daniel's empire. My father had taught me to notice small things. My art had taught me to tell stories with them. Humiliation, I realized, could be a lens that focused attention on what Daniel had been trying so desperately to hide. The second condition required cooperation. We were to host a family dinner at the company's hospitality suite and reenact a childhood memory, complete with photographs and old friends. The letter asked for authenticity, for laughter, for tears, for vulnerability. Daniel grinned at the idea. To him, authenticity was another performance he could control. He imagined charm and optics, a PR photo op. He did not see the vulnerability he would be compelled to show. I agreed to help arrange the photographs. The plan needed the right images, the ones that would, when placed side by side, reveal a pattern of omissions and edits. I spent nights poring through boxes of family albums, scanning every photograph, every caption. I found images where someone had been cut out of a group shot, where a ledger page had been folded to hide a line, where a dedication in an old company brochure had been replaced. These were small acts of erasure, the same patterns Daniel used when carving the company out from under others. I made prints, subtle but precise. At the dinner, when Daniel scoffed at my nostalgia, I positioned those photographs on the table as part of the evening's recollection. We laughed, we ate, and at the precise moment the lawyer asked a question about who remembered the summer of '98, I pushed a particular photo forward and let a silence grow. The picture showed Daniel at a meeting with men who would later become his cronies, hands on a contract signed in a handwriting unclearly familiar. Heads turned. The silence became a net. Each task my father designed felt like a legalistic performance, but the deeper design became clear. Expose the pattern of erasure, humiliation, and theft by forcing the perpetrators to reenact their crimes under the eyes of witnesses. The conditions were small enough to seem trivial but circled the truth like wolves. I was not the only one learning. Board members who had once laughed at my quietness now leaned forward, puzzling over inconsistencies. Whispers started, the kinds that grow into questions. Daniel's veneer began to show hairline cracks. Meanwhile, I quietly befriended a young compliance officer at the company, a woman named Mara who had been overlooked by management but who took pride in tedious truths, ledgers, timestamps, archived emails. I told her, in careful fragments, about the odd details I had found. She listened without spectacle and began to cross-reference things I'd never thought could be connected. She dug into vendor records, shipment logs, and the hazy signatures in old agreements. Her work was slow and invisible. That made it perfect. The will had promised exposure, but it did not dictate the method. My method was simple. Create a public stage that invited scrutiny, then seed that scrutiny with precise, verifiable facts. Once the scrutiny began to hum, my father's letters escalated. The next tasks would be harsher, requiring theatrical admissions and the opening of sealed correspondences. I could feel the rhythm of his design, a crescendo built from small, surgical reveals. My role was to turn the small reveals into an unavoidable narrative. Daniel would be forced to defend himself not just in the polite rooms where he thrived, but in the cold light of documentation and memory. At night, when the house was quiet, I read my father's letters again. There was a tenderness in his anger, a sorrow that had been misdirected in life but channeled into this posthumous justice. He had understood Daniel's hunger. He had understood my silence. He had believed that truth, revealed in sequence, would be stronger than any legal argument. I began to believe it too. So I played along. I apologized on the stage. I arranged the photographs. I whispered small hints to the right people. Each action felt like a brushstroke on a canvas that would one day reveal the portrait my father had painted for me, a portrait of a family that could no longer pretend its history was clean. And as the net tightened, my anger, the old quiet thing that had been carved out of me by years of dismissal, started to change into something else, anticipation with a moral edge. This wasn't petty revenge. It was a reclamation. The next letter promised a test of courage. Open a sealed box of family letters in which someone admitted to a crime. Daniel's laugh at that note had been brittle. He thought he could lie his way past the past. He had forgotten that paper keeps its own memory. He had forgotten that some confessions are easiest to write and hardest to deny. When he finally realized the gravity of the letters, the room fell into a hush heavier than any of his performances. Do you think I had the courage to force that final reveal? Would you, standing where I stood, use the stage your enemies trusted to bring them down? They thought the letters were just sentimental, but one confession can ruin an empire. The night we opened the sealed box was the first time I saw Daniel truly afraid. He had always been so confident, so loud, so smug, but when the lawyer placed that wooden chest on the table, his hands twitched against the polished surface. It wasn't just a box. It was a time capsule, a vault of secrets my father had hidden for decades. Every letter inside was addressed, dated, sealed in my father's careful handwriting. The conditions were clear. The letters had to be read aloud, one by one, in front of every beneficiary, every board member, and the lawyer himself. No skipping. No editing. No exceptions. Daniel laughed, pretending it was all melodramatic theatrics. But when the first envelope was opened and his own handwriting spilled onto the table, his laughter died. The letter was dated 15 years earlier. Daniel had been only 22. He had written to my father, begging for forgiveness after an investment went wrong. The words were clumsy, arrogant, but honest. He admitted to gambling with company funds, covering losses by falsifying numbers, and dragging his father's trusted friends into shady deals. The letter ended with a promise. It will never happen again, I swear. This company means too much to me. The boardroom erupted. Murmurs, gasps, narrowed eyes. I felt the shift in the air, the kind of shift predators feel when blood is spilled. Daniel tried to laugh it off, waving his hand like it was youthful folly. Everyone makes mistakes, he said. It was a long time ago, but the damage had been done. His invincible mask had cracked, and everyone saw it. The second letter cut deeper. This time, it wasn't Daniel writing. It was one of his allies. A man named Victor, one of the cronies who had mocked me at every turn. The letter described a scheme to funnel money into a shell company. He wrote to my father with mock humility, framing the theft as a strategic maneuver that Daniel had endorsed. I could see the lawyer's jaw tighten. I could hear the whispers of board members counting the missing millions. Daniel slammed his hand on the table. This is manipulation. These letters could have been forged. But his voice lacked conviction. His eyes darted toward me, then away. Because deep down, he knew what was coming. When my turn came, I opened a letter addressed to me. My father's words were sharp but strangely gentle. Claire, you have always been ignored. You have always been underestimated. But you notice things I thought no one else did. I leave you these letters not as a burden, but as a weapon. If you choose to use them, the truth will become impossible to bury. For a moment, my throat tightened. My father had seen me, really seen me, in a way Daniel never had. And suddenly, the humiliation of my childhood didn't matter. Because here, in front of everyone, I had the power. The next task was brutal in its simplicity. Each of you must explain aloud the contents of the letter you received, in your own words, without omission. It was psychological torture, and my father knew it. Daniel's face burned crimson as he was forced to summarize his youthful mistakes for the board. His cronies squirmed as they confessed their fraudulent schemes. The humiliation was total. These were men who thrived on power, forced to strip themselves bare in front of their audience. And I explained my father's words calmly, without shame. It wasn't a confession of sin, it was recognition. The contrast was blinding. But the true bombshell hadn't been opened yet. The final letter in that box was larger, sealed with a thick wax emblem. The lawyer handed it to me. My father's handwriting was unmistakable, for the one who betrayed me most. Daniel's face drained of color. He knew. I broke the seal and began to read aloud. The letter was a confession, not by Daniel, but by my father himself. He described how, years ago, Daniel had approached him with a proposal. To falsify tax records, to bury illegal transactions, to bribe officials. My father had refused. But then he discovered something worse. Daniel had gone ahead anyway. The success of the company's explosive growth, the prestige Daniel flaunted, had been built on lies, bribes, and stolen trust. The room was dead silent. My father's words were precise, undeniable. He admitted he had covered for Daniel at first, to protect the family name. But he also admitted his guilt, his shame, and his failure as a father. That failure, he wrote, was the reason he had crafted this inheritance trap. The letter ended with a single line that rang in my ears. Justice delayed is not justice denied. The truth will come out, through Claire. The silence broke into chaos. Some board members demanded audits. Others muttered about resignations. Daniel shouted over them all, calling it lies, fabrication, betrayal. His voice cracked in desperation. He turned to me, his mask gone, his arrogance shattered. You think you've won, he spat. You think you can run this company? You're nothing without me. But his words didn't sting anymore. Because now, everyone in that room had seen what he really was. The lawyer raised his hand, silencing the chaos. The conditions have not yet been completed, he said sternly. There are still letters to be opened. Still tasks to be fulfilled. Daniel collapsed back into his chair, seething, cornered. He looked at me with eyes that promised revenge of his own. But I didn't flinch. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the invisible one. I was the one holding the match, and Daniel was the one standing in a room soaked with gasoline. And my father had just handed me the flame. Tell me, if your sibling had betrayed you and stolen everything, would you light the fire? Or would you let them choke on the smoke of their own lies? They thought the worst was over, but the will still had one final twist. The box of letters had already shattered Daniel's perfect mask, but my father wasn't finished. The lawyer brought out a smaller envelope, plain, unmarked, ominous in its simplicity. This, he said, adjusting his glasses, contains the penultimate condition. And it may be the most difficult yet. The silence was suffocating. Daniel sat rigid, his fists clenched, his jaw locked. His cronies looked pale, as if they had suddenly realized their careers were tied to a sinking ship. The board members were restless, muttering under their breath, calculating what Daniel's downfall would mean for their shares. And me. I felt an almost frightening calm. Every step of this process had been designed with precision. My father's hand was guiding us from the grave, pushing us toward an inevitable reckoning. The lawyer unfolded the paper and read aloud. The truth must not only be spoken, it must be seen. Each beneficiary must stand before the company's employees and investors, and reveal the secret contained in their letter. Only then will the successor be named. The reaction was immediate. Daniel erupted from his chair. Absolutely not. This is madness. This is defamation. His voice cracked with desperation. But the lawyer's reply was cold. If you refuse, the company is dissolved, its assets liquidated, and every penny goes to charity. Your father's instructions were ironclad. For a moment, no one moved. The implication hung in the air like a noose. We weren't just airing dirty laundry in private anymore. We were about to hang it from the tallest tower, for the whole city to see. Daniel's cronies pleaded with him in hushed tones. They begged him to find a loophole, to silence the lawyer, to bribe me into backing down. But Daniel knew what they all knew. The will was a legal trap. Any attempt to defy it would result in losing everything. His empire was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do but comply. The date for the public reading was set. Invitations were sent to every major shareholder, every investor, every employee of rank. The event was disguised as a commemorative memorial for my father, honoring his legacy. But we all knew what it really was, a spectacle of judgment. I spent those days preparing. Mara, the compliance officer I had quietly allied with, provided me with more documentation. Scanned records, signed contracts, digital trails that lined up perfectly with the confessions in the letters. With every page, my father's genius became clearer. He hadn't simply hidden the truth. He had catalogued it, prepared it, and armed me with it. My task was simple: present the story in a way that no one could deny. Daniel, meanwhile, grew more erratic. He held late-night meetings with his allies, stormed through the house with rage, and once even cornered me in the hallway. His eyes were wild. "You think this makes you strong," he hissed. "You're nothing but a puppet. Father's puppet." His breath smelled of whiskey. "Without me, you're nothing. You can't even speak in a room without trembling." I looked him in the eye and said softly, "Then you'd better pray I stay quiet." For the first time, he had no response. The day of the memorial arrived. The company's auditorium was packed. Employees in stiff suits, investors clutching portfolios, journalists eager for a headline. At the front of the stage stood a podium draped in black, with my father's portrait looming above it. The irony was almost cruel. His face presided over the downfall of the very son he had once trusted. The lawyer took the podium first, explaining the conditions of the will to the audience. Murmurs spread through the crowd like wildfire. People shifted in their seats, curious, nervous, excited. Then the lawyer called Daniel forward. The sight of him walking to that podium was surreal. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. His letter trembled in his hand. He stammered through the confession, trying desperately to spin it as youthful mistakes and naive ambition. But the crowd wasn't buying it. Gasps echoed through the room, followed by whispers. When he admitted to falsifying financial records, an investor in the front row stood up in outrage. The damage was irreparable. One by one, Daniel's cronies followed. Each revealed their sins: siphoning funds, creating shell companies, bribing officials. The audience shifted from shock to anger, the murmurs swelling into open accusations. These weren't just private sins, they were crimes. The board members scribbled notes furiously, their faces pale as they realized the legal consequences. And then it was my turn. I walked to the podium slowly, every eye on me. I unfolded my letter, my father's words etched deep into the page. My voice was steady as I read, "Claire, you have always been overlooked, but you see what others miss. This company was built not only on numbers, but on people, people who believed in something greater than greed. If you are brave enough to speak the truth, you will be the one to restore what I failed to protect." I paused, letting the words sink in. Then, instead of folding the letter away, I reached into my bag and pulled out the documents Mara had given me. "My father's words are not just sentiment," I said, my voice louder now. "They are fact. And here is the proof." I laid the evidence on the podium, one page at a time. Copies of contracts with forged signatures. Records of bribes disguised as consulting fees. Emails where Daniel and his cronies joked about bleeding the company dry. The room erupted. Journalists leapt from their seats, cameras flashing. Investors shouted in fury. Employees gasped in disbelief. The weight of years of corruption had just been dumped into the public eye. Daniel lunged forward, trying to grab the papers. Security held him back as he screamed, his voice cracking into incoherent rage. "She's lying! She's lying! This is a setup!" But his words sounded hollow against the mountain of evidence. His empire was crumbling before him, and everyone could see it. The lawyer raised his hand for silence. His voice was calm, almost triumphant. "The conditions have been fulfilled. The truth has been revealed. And as your father instructed, the rightful successor is..." He looked at me. "Claire." The auditorium exploded. Some cheered, some shouted, some simply sat in stunned silence. Daniel collapsed into his chair, his face buried in his hands, his cronies slinking away like rats abandoning a sinking ship. For the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible. I was the center. But it wasn't over yet. The lawyer leaned toward me, his voice low enough for only me to hear. There is still one final letter. The last condition. And it's addressed to you alone. A chill ran down my spine. My father's revenge had dismantled Daniel. But what had he left for me? Would you open that final letter, knowing it might change everything? Or would you leave the past buried once justice was served? They thought the storm was over. But my father had saved the sharpest blade for last. When the crowd dispersed that night, the air was heavy with ruin. Daniel had been dragged away by security, screaming, cursing, threatening lawsuits that everyone knew would go nowhere. His allies scattered like cockroaches when the lights come on. The empire he thought was his birthright was crumbling faster than he could scream. And at the center of it all, I stood, declared the successor, the heir, the daughter no one had ever taken seriously. But the lawyer wasn't finished. After the cameras had shut off, after the investors had stormed out, he pressed a final envelope into my hand. A single name written across the front in my father's handwriting. Claire. For a long time, I didn't open it. I carried it with me back to my room, sat at my desk, and stared at it under the yellow glow of the lamp. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried not just words, but judgment. Part of me wanted to tear it open immediately. Another part whispered, what if it changes everything? What if it takes away even this victory? Finally, with trembling hands, I broke the seal. Inside were 2 pages. The first was a letter. The second was something else, something that made my breath catch in my throat. The letter began like all the others, in my father's precise, deliberate handwriting. Claire, if you are reading this, it means you have stood where I hoped you would. You have spoken truth. You have carried the burden I could not. And for that, I am proud of you. I swallowed hard, the words blurring as my eyes stung. My father had never said things like that aloud. He had been a man of silence, of stern looks and unfinished sentences. To see the words spelled out, I am proud of you, it pierced deeper than any dagger my brother's cruelty had ever left in me. But then the letter darkened. Yet pride is not the same as forgiveness. You must know the whole truth. I covered Daniel's crimes for too long, but I also covered my own. I let the corruption grow. I allowed the money to flow through places it never should have. I built walls instead of bridges, and I ignored what my silence did to you. I froze. My chest tightened. My father, the man I had defended, the man who had orchestrated this elaborate revenge, was confessing. This company was not built clean. Parts of it were poisoned from the very beginning. I cannot erase that. But I can give you a choice. Enclosed you will find a document, the means to dismantle everything, sell the empire, and scatter the ashes so that no one may ever corrupt it again. Or you may keep it. Rebuild it in your image. Use the power to create something better than I ever could. I unfolded the second page. It was a notarized document, signed and sealed. It granted me the legal power to liquidate the company entirely, to dissolve the empire my father had spent his life building. For a long time, I just sat there, the papers trembling in my hands. This was the final test. My father's revenge wasn't just about destroying Daniel. It was about forcing me to decide what justice really meant. Would I burn it all down, leaving nothing but ashes? Or would I carry the poisoned legacy and try to purify it? The days that followed were chaos. Daniel launched a media war, calling me a liar, claiming the letters were forgeries. His words fell flat. The evidence was too overwhelming. His allies abandoned him. Investors threatened lawsuits. Government regulators opened investigations. The empire was on fire. And everyone turned to me, the unexpected heir, the forgotten daughter, to see what I would do. I kept silent. I didn't answer calls, didn't release statements. Instead, I walked the halls of the company alone, looking at the portraits of my father in his prime, the awards, the plaques, the photographs of smiling employees who had once believed they were part of something noble. And I thought about what my father had written: "Justice delayed is not justice denied." On the third night, I called a meeting. Every board member, every senior manager, every remaining ally of the company filled the conference room. The air was tense, everyone waiting for me to declare my decision. I stood at the head of the table, the liquidation document in one hand, my father's letter in the other. "My father built this company," I began. "But he also let it rot. Daniel stole from it. His allies corrupted it. And all of you allowed it. You treated me like I was invisible, but maybe that was your mistake. Because when you don't look at someone, you don't see what they're capable of." A hush fell over the room. Eyes widened. Pens stopped moving. "I have a choice," I continued, holding up the document. "I can burn this company to the ground. I can dissolve it, scatter its ashes, and let the world remember it as nothing but corruption and greed. Or I can rebuild it, in my name, with new rules, new leadership, and no place for liars or thieves." Gasps rippled across the room. Daniel, who had somehow forced his way in, laughed bitterly from the corner. "You won't do it. You don't have the guts. You want the power too much. You'll become just like him. Just like me." I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel fear. I felt pity. "You're wrong," I said softly. "I don't want to be like you. And that's why I'm making my decision now." I held the papers over the table, letting the silence stretch, letting every single person in that room feel the weight of it. And then, I tore the liquidation document in half. Gasps. Shouts. Daniel's face twisted in confusion. "I won't burn it," I said firmly. "Because destroying it lets all of you off too easily. No, you're going to watch me rebuild it. You're going to watch me take every poisoned root you planted and rip it out. And you're going to watch as the forgotten daughter builds something better than any of you ever imagined." The room erupted in chaos. Fear, anger, disbelief. But I stood tall, calm, unshaken. Because I knew my father's revenge wasn't about fire and ashes. It was about justice. About exposing the truth. About proving that even the invisible one could become the force that changed everything. Daniel lunged toward me, his face red with rage, but security dragged him out once again. His screams echoed down the hallway. "You'll regret this. You'll destroy everything." Maybe I would. Maybe the challenge would break me. But at least I was free. Free from his shadow, free from the silence, free from being overlooked. That night, I placed my father's final letter back into the wooden box and locked it away. His revenge was complete. But mine was only beginning. Because this wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about legacy. And this time, the legacy would be mine.